Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Nau mai, hara mai, welcome to the 2024 University of Auckland Early Childhood Seminar Series June Seminar. It is really wonderful to be here in person, and I extend a very warm welcome to you all, and especially to those of you for whom this is your very first visit to the new home of the School of Learning, Development and Professional Practice in the city campus. So please join with me to open our time together with karakia, me e noi tātou. Kia hora te marino, kia whakapapa po namu te moana, hei huarahi mā tātou i te rangi nei. Aroha atu, aroha mai, tātou i a tātou katoa, haumi e, hui e, tai ki e. So thank you all for joining us for today's presentation by Dr. Christine Jones Diaz from Western Sydney University in Australia. It is a real pleasure for us to have Chris visiting here in New Zealand, and we're very grateful to her for her willingness to share her research on supporting and extending children's home languages in early childhood settings. So there's going to be, and I'm going to now hand over to Angel to introduce and welcome Chris.
So welcome everybody. I have been given the task to introduce Chris, but Chris and I have known each other for a while now. Several years ago I went to Western Sydney University to visit Chris, so we're just reciprocating the generosity. So I have been given the task to introduce her. So Chris is a senior lecturer in the School of Education at Western Sydney University and a researcher in the Equity for Social Justice and Inclusion Research Group. Her research and publications focus on languages, literacy, and identity negotiation in the context of diversity and difference. Her recent publication include a co-author and co-edited text, Diversity and Difference in Childhood, Issues for Theory and Practice, and I left a book over there, Understanding Sociological Theory and Pedagogical Practices. So the Diversity and Difference book was first published in 2005, and it's 2006, and right now it's the second edition. I use that book a lot in my own study, including my PhD thesis. So Chris has also authored numerous journal articles and book chapters pertaining to her areas of expertise. She is currently working with colleagues from the University of Sydney and the University of Auckland to examine the multilingual policy gaps in Australia and New Zealand for multilingual preschool children attending early childhood settings and community language schools. So due to a multilingual policy gap, in today's presentation, Chris will draw on Pierre Bourdieu framework of social practice, Stuart Hall's concept of identity construction, and Homi Bhabha notions of the third space to examine findings from a recent study that investigated educators' and families' perspective of the settings, policy, and practice in the absence of a broader curriculum frameworks that informs early language learning and teaching. So I'm really excited about the seminar because I use all these sociological and cultural theories and concepts in my own work, and they have shaped how I see the world. Welcome, Chris. The floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you, Angel, and thank you, Justine, for the beautiful welcome and introduction. I'm honoured to be here, and I'm enjoying my stay, and been looking forward to this presentation. So I hope that you get a lot out of it, and I'll talk for a bit, and then we'll have a bit of a discussion. So you can save your questions to the end. I'm happy if you want to interrupt me. We've got a fair amount of time, so we're not sort of rushing to get through. And I quite prefer just to hands up, or what do you mean by that? I find that a bit better. So as Angel said, this presentation is based on some findings of a recent study that I've completed, and essentially it kind of highlights the gaps in multilingualism, early multilingualism, despite the fact that we have quite a lot of well-established research documenting the multiple benefits of bilingualism. So for more than 50 years, there's literature going back to the benefits of bilingualism, particularly in early childhood. But I find the paradox is that this is that this is not really kind of evident in early childhood education. Okay, so I know this is evidence, this lack of educational take of this topic is evident in the lack of national policy that addresses early multilingual education. There's a limited attention given to the role of early childhood educators in terms of how they operate in this space around language retention and extension. So it also, we also have in this presentation reference to the sector called the community language schools sector, which I know here in New Zealand is not profound, although there are community language schools in Australia, particularly New South Wales, Victoria. They are really carrying the burden, the workload of language retention for immigrants and Indigenous children as well. Indigenous Australians also have community languages. This presentation reports on a study that I've conducted that examined educators and families' perspectives of their children's settings policy in the absence of the national broader curriculum framework. So essentially, there were two research questions, and the first one is looking at the parents' perspectives and experiences of their children's maintenance and use at the setting. So we wanted to find out what are the parents thinking about their children's use of the language. And the second question was about what were educators' perspectives of the pedagogical approaches that they were implementing at their settings to support children. And it's interesting because, as I'll talk in a minute, the findings between the two sets of participants are quite contradictory. There's quite a bit of a disconnect in terms of pedagogy, right? In terms of pedagogy. Okay, so as we know, Australia is a multicultural society. We have, 50% of Australians have an immigrant background, ancestry overseas. We have over 300 languages spoken. But I came across this fantastic statistic just a few years back that was conducted by the Australian Early Development. And according to them, in young children from birth to 6, within the population of Australian young children, there are 323 languages spoken, which fantastic statistics. So children under 6 of the population of Australia, over 300 languages of those children. In 25% of those children speak languages other than English at home, quite high. And with the Indigenous population, that is growing, it's increasing to 17%. So we have a very vibrant, active home language use in families and communities outside of education. If we look at those statistics, the communities and the families are using their language. So Australia's super diversity is apparent in the linguistic repertoires of children growing up in multilingual families and communities in urban and peri-urban communities. So peri-urban is like western suburbs. In New South Wales we have a western, outer western, far western. We call peri-urban. They're kind of regional but urban at the same time. But, with all this diversity and all these numbers, the gaps in policy, curriculum and pedagogy in the early childhood sector is huge. So we have quite a lot of work to do. We would think that given this context of super diversity, that there would be active government policy supporting multilingualism in the ECE sector, right? Zero.
No-brainer?
No-brainer. Not happening. Hasn't happened. Never happened. And it's a major challenge to get the government sector to even pay any attention. And I'll talk about that in a minute. While I say that, there is quite good support for inclusion. So I'm coming to this kind of understanding that we've got inclusion, but after inclusion we've got nothing. So there's a difference between inclusion and intentional teaching and extension of children's languages. So it's like in early childhood, we're really very concerned about play and learning and, conceptual development. We don't just do, play as a tokenistic thing. We do play seriously, right? We plan for play. We observe children to know how to set up an environment based on play, right? Yeah. When it comes to languages and cultural and identity stuff, we don't do any of that. We do inclusion. That's what we do. That's all we have to do, because that's where, and I'll talk about that in a minute, the frameworks are really just doing inclusion. There's no policy. There's nothing besides that tell us it's not mandatory. It's not considered important enough. But there is a lot of anecdotal evidence out there that there are multilingual programs in existence, and the findings from this research is reporting on 2 services that do a really great job at doing this intentionally. Well, some of it's intentional. But the problem is it's ad hoc, it's temporary, and it's under-acknowledged. So you get a great director that comes along and gets the whole thing working. She stays for 12 months and she's off, and the program collapses because no one has to do it. It's not mandated. It's not considered as important. More things are more important. There are bigger fish to fry, and this is what I think is the problem. In New South Wales, I'm speaking from New South Wales, there's a lack of investment, policy guidelines, curriculum frameworks and support that promote the retention and extension of children's home languages, and this impacts on the effectiveness of home language support and early language teaching and learning in ECE schools and community language schools. While in Victoria, so Victoria is a bit of a, as I said before, there's support, there's inclusion, but Victoria does do intentional teaching, and that's because Victoria's always been ahead of the game. But it's another reason is that they have just recently invested $20 million into the delivery of 5,000 preschools. So in Victoria, the preschools get between 2 and 6 hours of languages learning and teaching. And of course, that requires bilingual staff to be teaching those languages. And of course, there's a program of support. I went down there last year, and it's an incredible movement of bilingual, multilingual early childhood educators working in this space, and they're so dedicated. They're incredible. So within that program, there are many programs, and it's pretty serious. They're taking it really seriously. The rest of the states of Australia are just looking at Victoria in awe and jealousy because it's such a good thing. As I said, all the other states, there are no targeting funded programs for early languages education. So the actual real intentional work remains absent. Despite this, and the good news is that the community language sector, which I said before, is basically, it's a sector that's volunteer-based. In New South Wales, I ran a community language school for 24 years. It was based all voluntary work for 24 years. It's, you receive $100 a year per child to run a school. And you're supposed to, with that money, pay teachers. So you can imagine how poorly paid the teachers are. Most of them run on the oil of the rag, the smell of an oily rag. It's a lot of work. It's unrecognised. But the interesting thing that's happening now is that there's increased enrolments of under fives in these schools, and there's no funding for under fives. So when I was running my school, I'd get phone calls. I'd get 2 or 3 calls a week from parents wanting to enrol their 3 and 4-year-old, and I would say no because there's no funding. I can't do the job properly. And so I'm doing some research at the moment in this, and some really scary things happening out there, like scary things around safety. Little 3-year-olds sitting in desks, right? Little 3-year-olds and educators not been early childhood trained, but working with 4 and 5-year-olds and doing a lot of pedagogically unsound work. That's not to say that the other work they do is fantastic. It's interesting that this is for me, telling me that parents want their children to learn their language. Parents are voting with their feet. They're sending their children to these programs. So this is significant for languages learning from various perspectives, and I'm more interested than ever than the equity perspective and the language rights perspective, because early childhood education can play a major role in the retention and extension of world languages, Indigenous languages and minority languages. It's so easy in early childhood education to support language and to teach intentionally, work within language learning. It's much easier working with 3-year-olds than 13-year-olds in this space. There is an increased awareness from families of young children of these multiple benefits, but despite the limitations in extending children's home languages in early childhood settings, we have these two plays in the field that really we have to look at what is the role then of early childhood and community language schools, because this is where the children are enrolled. So this 24.6% here is about the increased enrolments in preschoolers, and the research I'm currently doing at the moment has shown, this was in 2022 in that report that my colleagues have written about community language schools and other, basically just a generic report about community language schools, but we have a 50% increase now. So in the space of 21 to now, we've got double the numbers of children in in under 5s enrolling in community language schools. So this is quite significant. And that's the information, that the work that I'm doing at the moment, the under 5s in CL schools. So this is important work because there are a few studies. So, I said before that there are studies that have looked at the benefits of bilingualism in early childhood, but the contradiction or the problem is that there are few studies that are looking at how ECEC supports children to have these benefits. So the linguists have looked at children at home, their parents speaking languages, all these multiple benefits. But the fact is that a lot of kids go to childcare. So they're not at home 5 days a week. They're actually in English-only speaking childcare services, right? So there's very little research done in this area. So there are a few studies that address the benefits of home language support in the sector, and the findings, these few findings that are unknown to educators. So educators don't know, they're not getting, because there's so few studies being conducted, educators don't know what the findings of these studies are. And this is all despite well-developed understanding of the benefits of multilingualism in Australia. There is limited research on parents' and educators' perspectives of the role of the sector in facilitating, promoting and extending. So the players are us. Early childhood education have to do something about this, because children are not at home getting the language from their parents. Their parents are working. And their parents come home cooking dinner, and how much of the language are they speaking is going to be affected by the fact that their parents are not at home, they're working. So in terms of the role of early childhood education, I think it's really significant that, there is a huge role there to play. So this also highlights the importance of family strategies and family policy as well that can be adopted by parents. So I think that we have a lot of work to do between parents and educators in working together. In the absence of policy, in the absence of curriculum guidelines, there's a very big space here for us working with parents and community. So this study then was looking at educators' reflections on what they were doing in their pedagogical work and the families' experiences and perspectives of their children's retention and extension at the setting of their home language. Essentially, there are two findings. The first finding is about this, going back to this, the educators have well-developed understandings of these benefits, but there is confusion about how to do it. So we know it's good, we know it's beneficial, we know we should be doing something, but we don't really know what to do. So there's confusion regarding appropriate pedagogical approaches because we don't have we don't have curriculum. Parents were really supportive of the work that the educators were doing in these two settings. They understood the multiple benefits. So the parents And there's some data to show that the parents actually want more intentional teaching. Some parents wanted more intentional teaching. So I think these findings have broader implications for home language support and languages education in our sector. So the theoretical frameworks that I used, I'm not going to bore you to death with this. I'm just going to lure light, but I'm going to integrate it into how I have understood the findings. But I do need to say that, as Angel said, I'm drawing on Barber and Hall, which are basically looking at cultural studies or cultural issues, and Bourdieu is a sociologist who looks at the reproduction of inequality. In education, his work is really highly used. So I'm looking at the production of linguistic inequality in pedagogy and policy, and obviously, from my perspective, when a child goes to an English-only setting and doesn't learn their home language, they are experiencing linguistic inequality because the capital or the benefits that they've gained in speaking their home language stop at the door because nobody's there to speak to them. So they're virtually having to learn English very quickly to actually survive the English-only setting. But I think it's important that the work of Bourdieu can help us understand that it's very important for us to depart from this deficit approaches towards multilingualism. Despite the fact in Australia that we have so many languages spoken, we still have deficit attitudes towards bilingual children. Bilingual children are still sent to speech therapists because they're not learning English fast enough. If they've got an accent, there's a phone call to the speech therapist. This child's got an accent, there's something wrong, he shouldn't have that accent by the time he's 5 because he's been in this centre for 6 months. There's really and speech therapists themselves are not getting this information either. So that's another story. I won't go there because I won't stop.
Speech therapists.
The speech therapists themselves are quite ignorant of multilingual language learning, multilingual development,
Right.
because they're mainly monolingual. And their whole training is about one language, not three. So what we have here, and I'm borrowing from Bourdieu where he talks about, a very famous Australian linguist, Michael Klein, talked about the Australian landscape as being a monolingual mindset, it's a mindset that informs everything we do in pedagogy, right? Goglan is a German scholar who draws on Bourdieu's notion of habitus to talk about the monolingual habitus. So the monolingual mindset is everything's English, right? And because everything is English, you don't think about anything else but English. So you don't think about, how to extend children, how to even do inclusion, And so when you've got a mindset, the practices, the attitudes, the dispositions, which is Bourdieu's habitus. Bourdieu's concept of a habitus is about how we do things, how we perceive things, how our practices and dispositions towards things, which start from the early years. You know what you mean. You get into the car, you drive the car, and it's quite automatic, right? You should be putting your phone away. That becomes a habit. So Bourdieu's work is very, very important around not just habit at the subconscious level, but habit at the conscious level as well. So the way we're sitting today is an academic habitus. We don't sit on the floor, for example. We don't, in a childcare centre, the routines are habitus. Okay, so I find that that's an interesting connection. Also, in terms of prestige, Bourdieu's work is really helpful in helping us understand that the official languages of all countries are the ones with power. So in English for Australia and New Zealand, German for Germany, Arabic for Arabic-speaking countries. Those languages have the power because they are official. New Zealand has 2 official languages. So that's why Maori has survived. Maori has official status. It has more officiality than, say, Spanish or Vietnamese. Vietnamese, all the other languages are non-English languages like Maori, but Maori has official status. This notion of having official status is really important. It's very important.
Excuse me, just a clarification. New Zealand actually has 3. The third one is sign language. How do you deal with a culture where sign language may not be part of the culture for immersion and integration.
So when you say into a setting,
Into any setting where you've got
the same issues
within the home,
yeah,
you've got a child within that setting
Yeah.
that may be deaf,
yep,
and then they're going to a
They're signing.
that is primarily English.
yeah, that's the same
and there are at
issue.
least 5 different variations of the
Yeah,
communication in sign language. American, British,
yeah.
New Zealand has its own.
So in Australia, Auslan it's official in terms of being the official sign language. In Australia, we have Auslan and you have New Zealand Sign Language. So I'm not talking about that kind of level of officiality. I'm talking about officialdom at the top level. So maybe Auslan, maybe those languages are official for the deaf community.
How do you go about integrating sign language into the communication for an early child?
Well, exactly. There's another space, isn't there, of complete exclusion because it's not happening. But it's an interesting... Yeah, no, that's interesting. It's a very good, important space to look at. It doesn't. I'm not looking at that, but again, the same issues that I'm highlighting here are also relevant to sign language. Yeah, and particularly in terms of pedagogy and policy and curriculum, like where is the support for educators working with deaf kids? Doesn't exist. Why? Because the curriculum, and there's no curriculum around that. We have to scramble and look at what the curriculums we have. We have to interpret what can we get from that. And this is what my findings have found. But hang on. When children do have language, access to their language in the setting, or if they're getting Auslan in the setting, things are amazing. Things change for those children. Because all of a sudden, because somebody's speaking to them and validating their existence, that language becomes what Bourdieu would talk about as symbolic capital. But all those other processes of capital that Bourdieu talks about, cultural capital, which is knowledge, language, social capital, which is networks, and when you've got networks, you can get power, and economic capital is how much money you have. And education, pedagogy has not much to do with how much money someone has, although of course we could argue that you can go to expensive schools if you've got money. But that's not about teachers. That's not about us, per se. But Bourdieu's work is really important for looking at education in terms of cultural capital in particular, and the various forms of cultural capital. So when children have access to learning their home language at the centre, they accumulate. So Bourdieu's notion of accumulate and transfer and conversion is really important. You might have cultural capital in one context, in one field, and you might go to another field and have no cultural capital because your knowledge, your experience in that other field, there's no validation for it. Do you know what I mean? So he talks about how when we move across different social fields, the cultural and linguistic capitals are dependent on the field, and then that informs and influences your habitus, how you operate in that field. We can give you some examples later if you want to go back to this. I just don't want to bore you with theory at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. But drawing on Stuart's Hall work is really important because he helps us understand how identity is not fixed. It's contested, it's transformative, it's hybridised, it's negotiated, and that, not that Hall said this, but I use Hall's work to look at how that operates in language. So when a young child is speaking Arabic fluently up until the age of 3 and he goes to preschool, all of a sudden he doesn't speak Arabic, she or he doesn't speak Arabic. Learning English is an EALD learner, has very few words to say, but when he goes home and speaks Arabic, he's a proficient, competent human being. In the centre, he's a silent little mouse. And that informs his learner identity, his identity as a child. So I think that Stuart Hall's identity is really malleable. It's a very flexible tool to help understand how these complexities operate. So I use his work. And then there's my other friend, Homi Bhabha, whose work is famous for what he calls the third space. And he talks about how many immigrants are operating around a third space, which is based on, the mixing of ethnicities, which is hybridity, the mixing of people from the diaspora, we can talk about the Chinese diaspora, we talk about immigrant communities and their diaspora once they immigrate to other countries. So these are offering new potentialities of identity. But for me, again, I wonder, how does that happen for multilingual children? How does that happen in terms of language? And neither Stuart Hall nor Homi Bhabha or Bourdieu, none of them said much. Bourdieu said a lot about language, but he didn't say much about multilingualism. So there's some gaps even in the theorists. Okay, let's get to the study. There were 8 children in the study, 8 parents, obviously 8 parents, 8 children. They were the parents of the children. 4 educators across 2 settings. One setting, the LD preschool, was a Spanish-speaking setting. Majority of the staff spoke Spanish, all fluent Spanish speakers, and they just spoke it like I'm speaking to you in English. Didn't think about when they used the language because it was, okay, we speak Spanish. They were don't advertise themselves as a bilingual centre, which is interesting.
Why not?
I asked that question and they said, we're afraid to do that because we'll be seen as being separate from the community. And they still, to this day, they still don't advertise themselves as a bilingual. And the data actually talks a little about this. So the other setting was a preschool setting for 4 to 5-year-olds. And this preschool setting, at the start of this research, the organisation that runs these preschools funded a Mandarin-speaking teacher who was working with me studying, her grad dip, funded her to work with them for 12 weeks with the Mandarin-speaking kids because they had a lot of Mandarin-speaking kids in the centre. The kids were running wild. The teachers didn't know what to do with them. They didn't know English, and at this stage the centre wasn't doing anything in this space. The parents were really unhappy. They were the faces were not a lot of communication, and there was a really interesting miscommunications going on until Lily, the educator, turns up and things change. And she was an educated, early childhood educator, so she really understood intentional teaching. And we'll talk about her in a minute. So there were 4 parents in this. The data that I talk about in this particular presentation is from 4 of the parents, 2 from each setting and 3 teachers. The settings were inner city and northern western suburbs of Sydney, which are both really diverse, super diverse communities. And it was part of a broader study then that was looking at the needs and demands of multilingual families regarding home language support for their children. These settings were chosen based on their existing pedagogical approaches towards bilingualism. So with my student going into this service with the intention to do some work in this area, and the Spanish-speaking preschool because they didn't call it immersion, but they were doing immersion. They didn't call it anything, as we know. They didn't call it anything. They just spoke Spanish. I drew on both quantitative and qualitative approaches, but the data in this paper is more about the qualitative, and I'm focusing on the interview data, not the observations. And we can skip that bit, but it's there if you want to ask questions about the kind of analysis in vivo, discourse analysis and critical discourse analysis, where you look at the themes and you're drawing on these theories to understand the complexity around these themes. So essentially there are 3 findings, but the first lot of findings are about the parents and what they were thinking, and we have 5 distinct categories. So one is about the intergenerational communication and familial benefits. Another finding was around cultural identity and heritage. Then there was the psychological and wellbeing factors. There was the economic imperatives for languages learning, and there were views regarding the bilingual program, the policies and the pedagogies that were used. Now, this is based on what the parents were saying. So obviously, when we do research, we group things into categories. So these are the 5 major categories that came up. The second lot was about educators' and parents' perspectives and the differences between. So the parents were concerned for intentional teaching versus the educators' perspectives towards intentional teaching. So 2 groups of participants, as I said before, had a slightly different understanding of what intentional teaching is. Leadership and advocacy was raised really prominently, particularly in the preschool, in terms of how to support bilingualism. Leadership was really important. And the role of curriculum came up and the absence of policy. And then the third finding was that there were concerns around continuity. And this came from one of the parents from the Spanish preschool, where he was concerned about what's going to happen after my child goes to school. So the parents' perspectives about language maintenance. So if we start with what the parents thought, intergenerational communication is really important between, I know this, I've just had a granddaughter, and I want my granddaughter to speak Spanish, so I'm only speaking Spanish to her because no one else will. No one else will. And I want her to have family connections and a sense of identity. The relationships then are maintained through the use of the home language. So grandparents, I wrote this before my grandchild was born, right? So when I look at this, I go, wow, that's so important now. Grandparents play a really huge role in maintaining the linguistic and cultural resources. They have resources that they use. And we can see this in this quote from Millie's mum, who said, when grandma comes to visit, she teaches Millie the tongue poems. And in China, if your child can cite a tongue poem, everyone is happy and the child will think she's good. So this is a very Chinese way of giving a child self-esteem and praise. She enjoys being praised. And if we look at Barbara's notion of the third space, we can see how agentive this is for Millie and the grandparents and Millie's mum. Because within this little snippet of a literacy sample of learning to read a poem, right, we see a relationship operating between language, culture and identity, and we see that it's fluid, agentive. This is just a little snippet, but this is the sort of thing that the grandparents were doing all the time. So if we're borrowing from literacy and identity studies, diverse literacy practices and cultural representations give us opportunities, multilingual children, greater opportunities for meaning making and identity construction. But identity is expressed through belonging, solidarity and collectivity. That's what Stuart Hall says. In this quote, we see this parent talking about how for her the home language is a language of love. This is a parent from the Spanish, Spanish is a language of love. Our heritage, family roots and identity is expressed in language. Everyday use, it's in there. There's about 25 or 15 words to say I love you in Spanish. It's a Romance language. So, identity operates in language. Home language retention and multilingual education is critically important in this process. So in terms of cultural identity and heritage, all parents express strong attitudes towards retaining their children's home language, believing it essential to maintaining strong links. So this is a really sad quote where this parent says she's observed many Chinese descent children completely stop speaking Chinese when they reach adolescence. They completely deserted their Chinese culture. She says this is not just a generational gap, it's a cultural gap. The gap is beyond repairment. So she says it's a huge generational gap, not only a generational gap, it's more. It's a gap between two cultural backgrounds. So I find that quote really profound, actually. And going back to Barbara's work, hybridity and diaspora enables us to see how multilingual families and children experience their contemporary cultural heritage and intergenerational experiences. That also has an impact on maintenance. So if you can see that your heritage is expressed through your language, you want to speak that language. It's a no-brainer. So language retention and identity negotiation is closely linked in the multiple and hybrid ways of belonging, drawing on Hall, across diverse linguistic, cultural and family landscapes. The third space identity can be contested, negotiated and renegotiated. So I'm trying to bring all of these into the space of early childhood. This quote here is really important, and it kind of it shows us that this parent, they go overseas to Argentina and they're really happy that the child is speaking Spanish and communicates to everybody, not just the parents, can see the language is legitimate, it operates in the streets, it operates in society. So this parent ends this quote by saying there's a whole cultural and social thing that relates to being bilingual. It's everything. It's not just about the words you speak in your mouth, it's everything. And if we look at Bourdieu's notion of social capital, where, you have networks, friendships, collaborations, this child is actually accumulating social capital as she goes to Argentina. And that she brings that back, and hopefully it continues for her life. So the psychological factors, again, if we look at Millie was a child that was really unsettled, virtually crying every day since she started in the setting. And this is why my student was called in, really, for Millie, because Millie was just inconsolable. And she just recently arrived, and then when the Mandarin teacher starts, Millie's mother says the use of Mandarin, well, I'll tell you what she says in a minute, but the use of Mandarin was a really important strategy that supported Millie's well-being, and it helped her to adapt to the educational context. Mandarin, the use of Mandarin provided her daughter with a safety net for communicating with the Mandarin-speaking teacher. And here we go, we see the mother talking about this teacher makes my child feel strong. She is a great change. She gets on well. My daughter gets on well with the teacher when she's at school. She speaks her mind frankly. You have agency in operation there with the teacher. This teacher is like a special child. The parent is not concerned about the child learning English, which is often what the teachers say. Oh, particularly the Mandarin-speaking parents, they want their child to learn English. Yes, they do, but when they see how their children have so much agency and confidence when they get to speak Mandarin in a learning environment, it's transformative. Because Mandarin for Millie becomes a language of currency, a language of legitimacy. She's able to accumulate linguistic capital through the deployment of a linguistic habitus, speaking without thinking, as she negotiates this new educational environment and learn English at the same time. So again, we're highlighting the role of multilingual educators in this process. So Ellie's another mum that saw Mandarin in the classroom as a good strategy to help her daughter learn English. So we're not forgetting English. English is still being learned. Some people say, well, what about English? Well, English is happening. She's not good at English, she cannot speak it, she can't express it, no one understands her, but the Chinese teacher comes in and understands her slowly, and she integrates some English words into her conversation. And this, to me, says that there are clear understandings of the benefits of home language in the English language learning, the benefits for home language for learning English, but also when you do there's also this thing called functional multilingualism, speaking two languages for a functional purpose, but also purposeful translanguaging, where you're speaking two languages for a purpose. And that's what was happening here in this quote. And this makes it possible. Multilingual educators can do this. They have a really specific role. And the last thing that the last thing that the parents talked about were the benefits, economic benefits. This plays a role. So I think in the present, in the future, in view, speaking languages means possession of two technical skills. Another parent pointed to the economic career benefits. It's an advantage in our globalised world. I want my child to benefit from having a second language. If we look at Bourdieu's work again, we can see how early multilingual education enables children's languages to become legitimate forms of cultural, linguistic and social capital, which is later converted to economic capital. So if we focus on this in the early years is when it's easy and children continue to use their language, then they're going to get the economic benefits later. And the parents understand this. The parents understand it. And that's a really interesting finding. Okay, so the mother, this is views about the this is moving to the second finding, I think, where we're looking at the views about policy. Now, Timothy's mother is a bit, she says that I think that it's necessary to reinforce connections with the roots These kids have their families, they come from overseas, and it helps them with their identity. It goes beyond the practical use of language. It means it helps them know better where their families come from. I wish these programs, and this is a parent saying, it's so good, we need to have more of it. And we know it's so good for families to see this and for kids to know where they're coming from. So Timothy's mother regards multilingual education as an asset that attracts multilingual families to the settings. And she goes on to say, the fact that we have, this is the Spanish setting, the fact that we have focus on language attracts people not only from Spanish and Latin American backgrounds, but people from other languages and cultures. People see the value adding of another language for their kids' life. So I find that at daycare, there are people from all parts of the world, and they are quite open-minded for their kids to experience an environment where everyone is different, and that's a great thing. So she's not only focusing on how language attracts people, but she's focusing on the value of diversity. And that's fantastic. So we can see from these quotes, and these are only, and this is not all the quotes from all the findings, but parents are articulate. They know what's going on, and they know the benefits of multilingual education. And again, I think it goes back to the role of parents to advocate. Parents have to help us do this work. So the second finding is about, as I said before, the kind of disconnect between the pedagogical approaches, the concerns for the need of intentional teaching. They recognise that both parents and educators recognised that the ECE sector is ill-equipped to do this work, to integrate bilingual education into the setting. And this parent says she would like to see more structured activities. I know that they do cooking, reading, and they have extracurricular activities, but this is in English. So what she's saying here is they do intentional teaching in English. They don't do it enough in the other language. So she says she says it happens because the preschool teacher, the ECT, right, speaks English. But maybe we should add a special lesson where kids start to apply numbers and letters in the home language as they start learning literacy. So a typical early childhood teacher would look at this and say, numbers and letters, that's primary school work, right? But this is the way she's expressing, I think, the need to integrate the learning, intentional teaching. And we know that intentional teaching is really important, don't we? So, and this is an educator in the preschool setting where a lot of Mandarin-speaking kids were going. She admits we're not really strategic about how we do this. And this is where we really need to attract people in the industry who have a diverse background, because these children are going to lose their language. If we don't have the multilingual educators speaking their language, this will impact on their potential for keeping their language, because nobody's speaking to them in the early years. So again, this highlights the importance of professional development for educators and the role of multilingual educators. So in settings where multilingual markets flourish, that's a Bourdieuian term, market, he's basically talking about the field, the context, okay? And he talks about everything in this economic analogy. Well, in settings where you have multilingualism and it's seen as value added, not deficit, multilingual educators and their work is legitimised. My God, you speak Portuguese, you can come here and work with us, and we need you. We want you. Your work, your language is invaluable. So their work is legitimised, and it challenges the monolingual habitus. And the monolingual habitus is often expressed by really well-meaning monolingual educators who say, but I can't do anything because I'm not bilingual. How do I promote children's languages? I can't speak their languages. You don't have to. No. There are so many other ways of doing it. And the educator who said this about we're not really strategic was monolingual. So she was saying, we as a monolingual, I need to be strategic. I need to work with multilingual educators so that their work, their expertise is legitimate. You actually have to make it happen if you're a monolingual director. It's
but
like...
It also assumes... Sorry, can I...
Yeah, no, yeah.
It assumes that the responsibility for all of this lies with the educators, and I don't think that's true.
No.
I think the conversation
Yeah.
Like that,
Yeah.
But the role of Te Whāriki as an early childhood curriculum means that it's a dialogue,
Mhm.
it's a community of learners. So if the expertise is not necessarily with the educators, then invite the parents.
I think that's the point, that
children to be the
it's the
teachers.
recognition that the expertise is not the early childhood educator.
Doesn't have to be, you know.
And I think when I said that a lot of monolingual educator directors will say, well, I don't know what to do, I can't speak that language. It's like, well, it's not my responsibility. So it's kind of the reverse of what you're saying, by for that person to give up their power and say, I've got to collaborate.
Well, I never think, I mean, I don't think of myself in that way.
Yeah.
As a teacher, I just think of it as I've got a certain set of skills.
A facilitator.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
That's exactly how we work,
Yeah.
I think. So again, I think that we have to, and drawing on Bourdieu, we can see how when we start to challenge the monolingual habitus, that we facilitate conversion strategies for accumulating linguistic, cultural and social capital for families. So all of a sudden, families will speak their home language to their children at the foyer and in the classroom. They'll speak to each other, they'll speak to the staff in the language because they know that it's valued and it's okay. So when we get to this differences of opinion around how to do this in pedagogy, there was a possible binary tension between care and education. You know that old stalewart that comes up sometimes in the field? This teacher's, I think, is really important, and I've kind of looked at this, I look at this quite often in multiple ways. She says, the teachers interact with children all the time using resources. The parents like that. Children are learning another language. We are not a language academy. She was very clear about that. This is the Spanish one, where everyone speaks Spanish.
Is this a parent or a child?
This is a teacher. She says, our target is to provide care, that the children feel safe, happy, and the home language is something that we do all the time, and they learn from it. Well, yeah, how? It is not that we provide language class for an hour like other places. So she's saying that we do care and education, we just speak a language. That's enough. So all the there was very little planning in this centre from the observations. The educators just spoke their language, but there was planning. Didn't really happen. Planning for other things happened, like play and other things, but planning for how do you scaffold children's conceptual development through Spanish. There was no explicit planning. And she reverts both to this sort of thing of we're not a language academy and we are not like language classes. So I think she's thinking about community language schools. I think what's going on here is that she's conflating intentional teaching with quantifying learning outcomes and testing. Again, it's highlighting the need for professional development in this space. Okay, so she was not an ECT, she was a diploma, she wasn't a teacher, this educator, so she was an educator. So we look at the early years learning framework and how this refers to intentional teaching as deliberate, purposeful and thoughtful. Maybe she hasn't read the framework. That extend children's learning. Multilingual educators can and should be extending children's learning through the strategies across a range of learning experiences, including group times, routine, play. These experiences expand children's repertoires through a planned approach. So I guess one of the things I'm really banging on about in my work now is it's no good doing this without a planned approach. Okay, we've got to have a planned approach to this. It's got to be planned. But the problem is, in the absence of broader policy and specific pedagogical frameworks, it still makes this planned approach ad hoc, because the framework isn't a bilingual framework, it's a mainstream framework. So leadership and advocacy came up as very important, where this educator, again going back to the preschool setting, she says, I really need to look at how I support families who've just moved here. I think that's my role. I think in terms of critical reflection, our job is to advocate for home language maintenance. So she was the monolingual educator or director. This teacher's emphasis on the critical role that educators play in advocating for multilingual education represents the interplay between cultural and symbolic capital. And symbolic capital from Bourdieu's work is that it's the accumulation of everything. When you, Prime Minister of this country in Australia, all Prime Ministers and predecessors, they have symbolic capital because they've got cultural, they've got economic, they've got social, they've got it all. So Bourdieu says you can't have symbolic capital unless you have other things that help you get there. So a university degree gives you symbolic capital. But to get that university degree, you have to study and learn, which is the cultural capital, right? So you're not just born with symbolic capital. So educators' embodiment of the cultural and linguistic capital is contingent. So educators have cultural and linguistic capital because they get, through their professional knowledge, I am the teacher, you are the parent. Teacher, parent, power relation. Even though we try to deconstruct that, teachers still have power. It positions, but in that power, we can use power for good, and we can use our power to advocate for the reproduction of linguistic capital, not the reproduction of language subtraction. So we can use our power for good. Again, we have to look at the EYLFA, which is the Australian Early Years Learning Framework. There is very little, and the work that Angel and I are doing at the moment is policy analysis of frameworks to look at how these frameworks see language and identity. While there is a lot of nice words about the home language in the updated version, there is still limitations in the utility of it because there's nothing explicit. There's no explicit pedagogical intent. We're not getting anything explicit about how to do this work. Like how do you run group time with 5 languages? How do you use multilingual staff in one group time? How do you use French, Cantonese and Vietnamese in story reading? Right? This is what people want to know, and the ELF doesn't give it to you. I've seen educators do this amazingly, but they've just done it through their own trial and error. You know, there's nothing written down, there's no framework. The second teacher points to however, we have to use what we've got. So this teacher points to the curriculum framework for direction in terms of how her setting operates in this space. And she says, these children don't really belong, they're not really becoming, and they're not really being who they are without bilingual teachers, without the research, new knowledge. These children would still be feeling somewhat disconnected. So this teacher is very good at using the framework to advocate. So in the framework, the 3 tenets are being, belonging and becoming. So, she knows how to talk the talk, I guess. So the third finding is about parents' perspectives about the continuity, and this parent is concerned that once the child leaves school, he's going to leave this Spanish-speaking setting and he's going to get into a more English-only speaking world, and that may hold him back in terms of incorporating his languages in speaking and writing, and that is a big concern. In Australia, in Sydney, there's a French school, a French bilingual school that was set up all about 20 years ago, and the children's French, when they get to year 6, is better than every other level of French that's offered to them in the secondary school. So the parents are like, well, there's no point in them learning French anymore because they're at such a high level. So it really can be done. The concerns about the transition to primary school in the context of limited bilingual education and resources is very evident, and this is echoed in the fact that in the primary and secondary education sector, there's not very often these same issues occur, particularly in secondary school. Children get to year 10 and year 12 and they drop their language for the HSC because there's a whole ranking system that puts languages learning at the bottom. So there's a whole plethora of issues in the primary and secondary system that prevent children from wanting to study their language at school.
Less damaging that their age standard would be at age 2.5.
Sorry?
Less damaging to drop the language at that age than to have a deficit model at a younger age.
I think it's more damaging to have a deficit model, because we're actually getting kids going into school who've lost their language. So they're going to primary school and they've lost their language, so they're not going to do community language, they're not even going to get to the HSC. But at least if we get them going, then they've got more opportunity to keep it going. But the problems are very systemic. All these problems are systemic. It's not the parents' attitudes, it's not about parents' anxiety about learning English, which is often the excuse we get, it's about the system. So this highlights the role of community language schools in as I've just said, the role of community language schools. So drawing on Bourdieu's notion of legitimacy, this lack of institutional policy direction, the legitimacy of languages, and the privilege of English is really the problem here. So we see that we have an imbalance of what language is valued. You know, which language, the language of legitimacy in Australia is English because it's official, essentially. And thank you. I just wanted to say thank you to my research assistants who were really, you know, helpful in the data collection and analysis. And that's it.
Bravo.